Hello, I'm Melaina, and this is what I learned this semester about the Kamiak Butte. First, we will look at the geologic formations of the butte. Plate tectonics cover the entire surface of the Earth and are constantly moving. Movements like subduction can create landforms and cause eruptions to occur. These eruptions are the result on the Juan de Fuca plate moving under the North American plate. The lava flows later turned into basalts that are still present. Eruptions that occurred about 15 million years ago caused about 350 lava flows. These lava flows then hardened into flood basalts. The flood basalts covered the entire Columbia and regions of the Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. As the molten rock rose above the Earth's crust, the surface began to sink, which caused the Columbia River Flood Basalt Group. During the Ice Age in North America, large sheets of ice were present in north of the U.S. and expanded down into parts of Washington, Idaho, and Montana. As the Earth went into a natural warming, these sheets of ice began to melt and pour out through the U.S. There was a natural reservoir created by a large piece of ice that blocked the Clark Fork River. The reservoir was known as Lake Missoula. However, the natural dam had failed multiple times, causing many floods. These floods led to serious geological consequences. The vast U-shaped coulees in the Wallula Gap is evidence for the massive flooding events. The floods caused the land to be eroded back. The floods were funneled into the Columbia River Gorge at the Wallula Gap, which will then be deposited into the ocean. Since the Wallula Gap paused the rushing of the floods, the sediment was built up in this natural dam. From there, the wind picked up the sediment and distributed it across eastern Washington. This distributed sediment is also known as loess soil. The geological layers of the Palouse can be used as evidence for the events that occurred. About 50 million years ago, the sedimentary quartz sand was distributed along the Palouse. Through natural pressure and temperature changes, these sands turned into quartzite. Air masses are constantly in motion within the atmosphere. The temperature of the air greatly impacts the movement and direction of the airflow. Warmer air tends to rise, while the cooler air tends to sink. The Coriolis effect is a phenomenon that involves the clockwise movement of the air between the poles and the equator. The air in the northern hemisphere is deflected to the right clockwise. Meanwhile, the air in the southern hemisphere is deflected towards the left counterclockwise. This creates a continuous circuit. The continuous circuit creates a temperature change. There are 4 main air masses in North America. This includes continental polar air masses, marine polar masses, marine tropical masses, and continental tropical air masses. Continentality reflects the amount the ocean influences the climate. The interior regions of the continent are less affected by the ocean. Because the ocean has a greater heat capacity, the coastal regions have a more stable climate throughout the seasonal changes. During the colder months, the heat from the ocean is released into the surrounding regions. This is due to the ocean's ability to absorb heat during the warmer seasons and then slowly release heat during the colder periods. The interior of the continent will experience extreme changes in temperature because of the lack of ocean to moderate the temperature changes. Mountains can affect the precipitation that occurs throughout the continent. As an air mass moves across the land, the moisture that is carried interacts with the land masses through cooling. Because of this moisture is lost through precipitation, areas that are more interior have drier air masses due to this loss of moisture. Major mountain ranges like the Sierra Nevadas, Rocky Mountains, and Appalachian Ranges affect the climate throughout North America. This can be seen through the rain-shadow effect shown. As you can see in the figure, the loss of moisture from the air masses occurs due to the topography of the continent. As an air mass is pushed up over the land formation, the area cools and the moisture condenses, producing precipitation. When the air mass reaches the top, the air mass is fluid, which pushes the mass down towards the land due to gravity. As the air mass descends, the mass warms and it is able to hold more water, as water vapor, which means that there is less precipitation in the region. The marine polar air mass had an effect on the formation of the Palouse. The less soils were deposited throughout the Palouse by the marine polar air masses that flowed through the Columbia River Gorge from the Pacific Ocean. The land has great success growing wheat because of the distribution of soils throughout the Palouse. The heavier soils were deposited along the Columbia, while the finer soils were deposited across the Camas Prairie of Idaho. Eastern Washington is a part of the western interior shrub steppe and woodland in the Columbia Basin region. The cover types in the Great Basin Desert and Palouse Prairie that are like the shrub steppe savanna. This is because of the sagebrush bunchgrass grassland and its affinity with the sagebrush desert and bunchgrass. The macroclimate of the Kamiak Butte is marine modified continental, which describes the influence the Pacific Ocean has on the region. Because of the continentality of the Kamiak Butte, the Pacific Ocean has a high influence on the region. The region is on the eastern edge of the rain shadow in relation to the Cascade Mountains, so the air is cooler and moister compared to the western side of the Washington. Additionally, the Rocky Mountains provide a barrier that keeps the colder and drier continental air masses away from the inland northwest. As shown in the figure, the majority of the precipitation occurs during the winter months. With the temperature averaging to be below 40 degrees, the precipitation is unusable. Most trees will die off during these months because the snow does not provide usable precipitation like the rainfall does. During the warmer months, the precipitation is usable and the trees have a greater advantage to surviving. From the field trip, we were able to use everything from in the classroom and take it outside, so we can actually make observations. We observed that the north-facing aspect of the Kamiak Butte is luscious and with many tree species including the ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and western larch. The reason for the large population of trees on the north aspect compared to the south aspect is due to the slope of the butte, which affects the sun exposure. The angle of the sun and indirect lighting allows for long shadows. These long shadows create a moist, cooler environment which is ideal for underbrush and many of these tree species. The north-facing aspect is biodiverse and is home to many plant and animal species. However, the south-facing slope is home to many grass varieties. The biodiversity contrasts to the north side and looks rather bare. The sun exposure on the south dries out this land, which makes it harder for ponderosa pine and western larch to thrive. Even Douglas fir species struggle despite their long roots. The south end is populated with wildlife including mule deer, coyotes, owls, and porcupines. By observing the tree populations on the Kamiak Butte, we are able to understand where the species are able to survive and the environmental conditions that are involved. From the north-facing aspect of the butte, we were able to collect data from the present trees. From the data, we were able to calculate the north-facing conditions with about 130 trees per acre. The high density and diversity of the plot represents the good living conditions. Because of the increased moisture and shadows on the north-facing aspect, the trees flourished in this habitat. From the tree samples on the south aspect, we are able to observe the drastic contrast in tree population and diversity. The only species observed was the ponderosa pine, and the calculations predict that there would be at least 35 trees per acre. It is also important to notice that the DBH, which also means diameter at breast height, on the south-facing aspect, it is about 17 inches. On the north-facing aspect, the average DBH is about 19.1 inches. Washington is home to many of the Native American tribes, including the Nimiipuu Nez Perce tribe, Shitsumush in Coeur d'Alene, the Cayuse in Walla Walla, and the Yakima Indian Nation. They all competed for the same resources, including salmon, deer, and the land. These tribes intermingled and oftentimes combined for many traditions. They all heavily relied on each other and kept the Palouse ecological sites thriving. The indigenous tribes have a huge influence over the Palouse and the rest of the country. Their practices and traditions are still seen within society today. It is important to recognize their sacrifices and their abuse that they overcame from the European settlers. One important face of Kamiak Butte is known as Chief Kamiakin. Kamiakin was mixed between Nimipu, Yakima, and Spokane ancestry. He was born as a natural leader. In his homeland tribe, he further developed irrigation, wildlife, animal husbandry, and community stability. He strongly believed in peace and would work to protect his lands from the U.S. government. He was a leader at a time when many settlers, miners, missionaries, and bureaucrats would seek the Columbia Plateau. Chief Kamiakin constantly encouraged peace among his tribes and his counterparts. He had a mutual respect between the majority of the priests that would visit. He didn't hold grudges when he was disrespected. However, Kamiakin's peacemaking was not enough to stop the government from forcing the land from him and his tribe. Chief Kamiakin was forced by the Washington Territorial State Governor to sign a treaty that forfeited their land to the government. The government had determined the Yakima Valley as an acceptable place for a railroad system. In 1854 to 1858, Chief Kamiakin led the Yakima War against the U.S. military. While he was the most respectful and powerful chief in the country, he was no match for the force of the U.S. military. In response to his defeat, he fled to Montana and British Columbia. He later moved back to Rock Lake, where he remained until his death. Despite his exile, he denied any gifts from the government and always discouraged the use of any violence. He refused to come back to Yakima Valley because he claimed he did not know it since the treaty changed it. This is a common theme that occurs when the European settlers and the U.S. government push out the Native American tribes. The Kamiak Butte served as a meeting place between bands of indigenous people. This signifies Chief Kamiakin's dedication towards keeping peace between tribes and to prevent warfare. Kamiak Butte honors Chief Kamiakin's sacrifice and honor. Because of the high winds creating the unique land formation, Kamiak Butte was a landmark for many travelers, and oftentimes messages were left using stones. The treatment of Chief Kamiakin and his tribes is a great representation of the terrible situation between the European settlers and Native Americans. Today, Native Americans and other natives protest for their rights and respect. From their prior abuse and discrimination, there has been dedicated reservations. However, no action will ever make up for what the Native Americans were put through.